First, do you remember a little group called Acorn, the Association of Community Organizations for Reform Now? Acorn was a community organizing group that was in some ways a lifeline to low-income families looking to get help finding a job or trying to find a home or trying to get some affordable health care. In many communities, Acorn was the group for the lowest income folks to turn to for help with issues like that. And I'm using the past tense here. I'm saying was rather than were or is, because Acorn no longer exists. Acorn no longer exists in large part because of this, because of a series of undercover so-called sting tapes filmed by a pair of conservative activists last year, tapes that supposedly showed Acorn engaged in all sorts of criminal activity. Acorn was ultimately cleared of any wrongdoing at some of the offices shown in those tapes, but after the heavily edited tapes were peddled to Fox News and run there on a constant loop week after week after week, the damage for this little community organizing group that could was already done. Acorn became the prime target for conservatives across the country. Republicans in Congress led the charge against Acorn. They launched a sustained, self-righteous, vituperative campaign to end all public funding of Acorn.
We need a thorough investigation of Acorn and why they have been authorized to get up to $8.5 billion in taxpayers' money.
We've had enough of these people, and we darn sure don't want to pay for them. We don't want to pay them to go out and break the law.
We've got more work to do, and that's why House Republicans are renewing efforts to defund Acorn once and for all.
Who has consistently called for the cleanup of the corrupt Acorn, the criminal enterprise Acorn, and all of their affiliates? It's been people on the Republican side of the aisle that have done that.
Acorn receives an outrageous 40% of its funding from hardworking taxpayers. This must stop. That's why we are fighting to defund this political machine.
Defund this political machine. Defund Acorn once and for all. That was the Republican call to action. Over and over and over again, and that's exactly what happened. The result of all that bluster was the Defund Acorn Act of 2009, introduced by Republican Minority Leader John Boehner, a bill that prohibited the federal government from awarding contracts, grants, or any other federal funds to Acorn. Defund Acorn legislation passed the House and the Senate, was eventually signed into law by President Obama. And what followed was a race among federal agencies to see who could end their contracts with Acorn the fastest. President Obama's budget director, Peter Orszag, fired off this memo to all departments and agencies. Quote, no agency or department should obligate or award any federal funds to Acorn or any of its affiliates. If your agency has an existing contract or grant agreement with Acorn, immediately suspend performance of any obligations. After that memo went out, the Defense Department called for the suspension of payments and subawards and subcontracts to Acorn and its affiliates. Then there was this announcement from the U.S. Census Bureau a month earlier. Quote, we are today terminating our partnership agreement with Acorn. And it wasn't even just the federal government. States tried to get in on the political act, too. Republican Governor Tim Pawlenty of Minnesota, quote, I am directing you to stop all state funding to Acorn. Of course, there wasn't any Minnesota state funding of Acorn at the time, but Mr. Pawlenty decided to make a big show of pretending there was anyway. In Louisiana, Governor Bobby Jindal issues order ending funding of Acorn. Again, it was not like Louisiana was funding Acorn at the time, but the backlash against the group was so strong that Governor Jindal could not resist pretending like he was rescinding state funding, even though that funding didn't exist in the first place. Acorn was public enemy number one. Thanks to mostly Republicans in Congress, there was a universal uprising against Acorn. These are bad people. They must be defunded. They must be driven out of business. And the Republicans who pushed for this thing got their wish. It was April 1st of this year when Acorn announced once and for all that it had shut all of its offices. April 1st. Flash forward 19 days to April 20th of this year. And the BP-leased Deepwater Horizon oil rig explodes in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 workers are killed. 2 days later, that rig sinks to the bottom of the ocean, setting off an environmental disaster unparalleled in American history. Quite literally, the worst environmental disaster this country has ever seen. What unfolds over the next few days is the story of a company that is, if not criminally responsible for this disaster, which I'm guessing they probably are, then there's something pretty close to it. Official documents filed with the federal government containing clear falsehoods in them, false disaster response plans, false estimates of worst-case scenarios, false statements of the company's capacity for dealing with a major problem. Witnesses start showing up, talking about shortcuts taken by BP on that rig, shortcuts that seem to have led to the disaster. Blatantly inaccurate lowball estimates given by BP repeatedly about the amount of oil being spilled into the Gulf day after day. Now it is BP that has become public enemy number one. But it's not because of some political witch hunt or some fraudulent, misleading political stunt cooked up for Fox News or for anyone else. BP is public enemy number one because of this. Because look at what they've done, what they can't fix, what they lied about, what they're still doing. Look at it. When Republicans took down Acorn, this supposedly giant democracy-crippling criminal enterprise, Acorn was receiving essentially pennies in federal dollars. According to reports at the time, Acorn had received, in total, about $53 million in federal funds since 1994. $53 million over 15 years. Right now, at this very moment, BP gets billions upon billions upon billions of dollars in federal contracts. If you go to usaspending.gov, you can find all of the different contracts that BP has with the federal government. $9 billion in contracts with the Defense Department, $2.6 million in contracts with the Veterans Affairs Department, $2.2 million with the Transportation Department, another $3 million in contracts with various other government agencies. So let's hear those calls from the crusaders in Congress to immediately end all of those contracts, right? To stop funding BP.
We've had enough of these people, and we darn sure don't want to pay for them. We don't want to pay them to go out and break the law.
That wasn't about BP. That, of course, was about Acorn taking federal money and breaking the law. You go get them, Congressman John Carter. For the record, 11 rig workers were killed at BP's oil well in the Gulf of Mexico 2 months ago. In 2005, 15 workers were killed at a BP oil refinery explosion in Texas. BP has chalked up criminal violation after criminal violation in Alaska, earning them a $20 million fine from the Justice Department just recently in 2007. If the hoax undercover pimp and hoe video on Fox News was enough to defund Acorn immediately and forever, what does BP have to do to get the same treatment? Republicans were basically tripping over themselves to bury Acorn last year, to put them out of business. Now they are lining up behind BP. At least some of them are. Last week, Dick Cheney's former campaign spokesperson signed on to become BP's new head of U.S. media relations. Today, there are reports that President Bush's former chief of staff, Josh Bolten, has also signed on to help advise BP through this crisis. And by crisis, he means their PR crisis. Republican members of Congress are doing their level best as well to help out BP in BP's time of need. Republican Senators Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and James Inhofe of Oklahoma have both blocked efforts in the Senate to raise BP's financial liability after this disaster from $75 million to $10 billion. Today, Republican House Minority Leader John Boehner, the top Republican in the House, John Boehner of Defund Acorn fame, the guy who introduced the Defund Acorn legislation, John Boehner backed a Chamber of Commerce effort to force taxpayers, to force you and me to help pay for BP's oil disaster, because heaven forbid they be responsible for it themselves. After a huge uproar over those comments today, John Boehner, late in the day, had to walk those comments back. Here's Republican Congressman Don Young of Alaska and his take on the BP oil spill.
This is not an environmental disaster. And I will say that again and again, because it is a natural phenomenon. Oil has seeped into this ocean for centuries, will continue to do it.
This an environmental disaster? No. Did you hear about Acorn, though? This year, in the wake of the big Defund Acorn effort, Acorn has received exactly $0 in federal contracts. Count them, $0. So far this year, and it's only June, BP has received $837 million in federal contracts. I'm not saying that I want Acorn to get back any of its piddling little federal contracts. I've said it before on the show. I will say it again. They were definitely an imperfect organization. But the Republican argument in favor of defunding Acorn last year was essentially, this isn't a witch hunt. This isn't about prohibiting federal money from going to an organization that doesn't have political aims that we want. This is about prohibiting federal funds from going to an organization that's committed fraud and worse. As the BP oil disaster inches toward its 2-month anniversary, as the Justice Department continues its criminal investigation into the company, as more evidence comes out detailing BP's negligence in the disaster itself, and we all every day watch the failure of the sad excuse for a cleanup afterwards, how many of the self-righteous defund Acorn crusaders do you think would get on board for the Defund BP Act of 2010?